Have you ever paused just for a moment and wondered what it means to wonder? To ask that question is to brush against one of the deepest mysteries in all of science. Welcome to Bedtime Biology, where science meets serenity. Each night, we explore the quiet wonders of the natural world, calming your mind and sparking your curiosity. Please like, subscribe, and comment below with where you're checking in from. Tonight, we're embarking on a journey through time and mind itself. We'll trace the origins of human consciousness from the ancient seas to the modern brain, exploring how awareness emerged from matter, how thought arose from biology, and how you came to be here, listening to these words, thinking about thinking. This is a story billions of years in the making, yet it unfolds in the 3 pounds of tissue resting between your ears at this very moment. Close your eyes if you'd like. Let your breathing slow, because understanding consciousness doesn't require strain or effort. It requires wonder, and tonight we have plenty of that to share. The question we're asking tonight is perhaps the most profound question biology has ever faced. How did the universe, which began as unconscious particles swirling in darkness, eventually produce beings who can look back at those origins and contemplate them? How did dead matter become aware? This isn't merely an academic curiosity. It's personal, because consciousness is the one thing you can never doubt. Even if everything else turned out to be an illusion, the fact that you're experiencing something right now, the fact that there is something it is like to be you, remains unshakable. The word consciousness itself comes from the Latin conscientia, meaning knowledge shared with others. It combines scio, to know, with cum, with. From its very etymology, consciousness hints at its social nature, its connection to communication and shared experience. But what exactly are we talking about when we speak of consciousness? The term has proven notoriously difficult to define with precision, which is part of why it has resisted scientific explanation for so long. In its broadest sense, consciousness refers to awareness, to sentience, to the quality of experience. It's what philosophers call phenomenal consciousness, the raw feeling of what it's like to be, the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the specific quality of tasting coffee or hearing rain on a roof. These qualities of experience, these qualia, as philosophers call them, seem to be the essence of consciousness. They're what make the difference between a being that merely processes information and a being that feels, that experiences, that knows. But consciousness is not monolithic. It exists in layers, in degrees, perhaps in kinds. There's the baseline awareness of simply being awake rather than asleep or unconscious. There's the awareness of external stimuli, the capacity to sense and respond to the world. There's self-awareness, the ability to recognize oneself as a distinct entity separate from the environment. And there's what we might call reflective consciousness, the uniquely human capacity to think about our own thinking, to be aware that we are aware, to ponder the mystery of our own existence. For most of human history, consciousness was considered beyond the reach of science. It seemed too subjective, too private, too ineffable to study with the tools of biology and physics. After all, you can observe behavior, you can measure brain activity, but how do you observe the subjective experience itself? How do you get inside someone else's mind to know what their redness looks like, what their pain feels like? This is what the philosopher Thomas Nagel highlighted in his famous essay, asking what it is like to be a bat. Even if we could map every neuron in a bat's brain, even if we could understand perfectly how its echolocation system works, would we ever truly know what it feels like to experience the world through sonar? Would we know what it's like to be a bat? This seemingly insurmountable barrier led some scientists to avoid the topic of consciousness altogether. It was too soft, too fuzzy, too philosophical. Others went further, suggesting that consciousness might be an illusion, a trick the brain plays on itself. But in recent decades, something has shifted. Neuroscientists, psychologists, and even physicists have begun to tackle consciousness head-on, armed with new technologies, new theories, and new ways of thinking about this ancient mystery. The journey we're taking tonight follows multiple threads through time. There's the evolutionary thread, tracing how consciousness emerged and developed over hundreds of millions of years. There's the neurobiological thread, examining the physical structures in the brain that give rise to awareness. There's the developmental thread, looking at how consciousness emerges in individual organisms, from embryos to infants to adults. And there's the philosophical thread, grappling with the deep conceptual puzzles that consciousness presents. These threads interweave because consciousness is not just one thing. It's an evolutionary achievement, a neurological process, a developmental milestone, and a philosophical mystery all at once. To understand its origins, we need to look at all of these perspectives, letting each illuminate the others, gradually building a picture of how mind emerged from matter, how the inner life of experience arose in a physical universe. The stakes of this question extend far beyond academic interest. Understanding consciousness touches on everything from medical questions about which patients in vegetative states might still be aware, to legal and ethical questions about which animals deserve moral consideration, to future questions about whether artificial intelligence systems might one day be conscious. But perhaps, most fundamentally, understanding consciousness is understanding ourselves. It's the ultimate act of self-knowledge, the culmination of the ancient Greek imperative to know thyself. So, let's begin at the beginning, or at least as close to the beginning as we can get. Let's travel back in time, back before humans, before mammals, before even the first fish. Back to an ancient ocean, over 500 million years ago, when something extraordinary began to happen, when the first glimmers of awareness started to flicker in the depths. The story of consciousness doesn't begin with humans. It doesn't even begin with mammals or birds or anything that would look remotely familiar to us today. The story begins in the Cambrian period, a time so distant that the very continents were arranged differently, when the air had less oxygen, when the land was barren and lifeless, but when the oceans teemed with an explosion of new forms. About 520 to 560 million years ago, something remarkable happened in Earth's oceans. Paleontologists call it the Cambrian explosion, and it marks one of the most dramatic periods in the history of life. Over a relatively brief span of geological time, perhaps 15 to 20 million years, nearly all of the major animal body plans that exist today appeared in the fossil record. It was during this period that the first complex brains evolved, and with them, quite possibly, the first stirrings of consciousness. Before the Cambrian, life had existed on Earth for over 3 billion years, but it was relatively simple. Single-celled organisms dominated. The few multicellular creatures that existed were soft-bodied, lacking the sophisticated sense organs and nervous systems that would come later. But the Cambrian changed everything. Animals began to develop eyes, the first camera-like eyes capable of forming images. They developed more complex body plans with distinct front and back ends, with bilateral symmetry, and crucially, they began to develop centralized nervous systems, predecessors to the brain. This neurological revolution was driven in part by new ecological pressures. With the evolution of predation, life became more dangerous and more competitive. To survive, animals needed to sense threats and opportunities more effectively. They needed to process information faster and make decisions more quickly. This created selection pressure for more sophisticated nervous systems, for better integration of sensory information, for more complex behaviors. The earliest neurons probably served simple functions, triggering muscle contractions in response to touch, perhaps, or coordinating the movement of cilia. But once neurons existed, evolution could begin to elaborate on them. Neurons began to cluster together into ganglia, small collections of nerve cells that could process information locally. In some lineages, particularly among the early chordates, our distant ancestors, these ganglia began to concentrate at one end of the body, the front end, where the animal first encountered the environment as it moved forward. This concentration of nervous tissue would eventually become the brain. The fossil record from the Cambrian gives us tantalizing glimpses of these early developments. We find fossils of trilobites with compound eyes containing thousands of lenses. We find fossils of anomalocarids, fearsome predators for their time, with large eyes and presumed keen vision. We find the earliest known vertebrates, tiny fish-like creatures called conodonts, and later jawless fishes, with the basic body plan that would eventually lead to all vertebrate life, including us. But here's where things get truly interesting from the perspective of consciousness. Having a nervous system, even having a brain, doesn't necessarily mean having consciousness. Plenty of organisms today have nervous systems, but may not be conscious in any meaningful sense. A jellyfish has a nerve net that coordinates its movements, but few would argue it has subjective experiences. A sea anemone withdraws its tentacles when touched, but this seems to be pure reflex, not conscious sensation. So, when did mere information processing become conscious experience? When did the lights turn on, so to speak? Neuroscientists Todd Feinberg and John Mallett have argued, based on extensive analysis of neurological structures and their functions, that consciousness likely emerged in the Cambrian period with the evolution of the first vertebrates and possibly some arthropods. Their argument rests on identifying specific neurobiological features that appear to be necessary for consciousness. These include the ability to create what they call isomorphic neural representations, essentially internal maps or images of sensory information that preserve the spatial relationships of the external world. Think about your visual experience right now. If you open your eyes, you see a coherent image of your surroundings, with objects arrayed in space, some near and some far, some to the left and some to the right. This image, this visual scene, is constructed by your brain from the patterns of neural firing in your visual cortex. Importantly, there's a systematic mapping. Neurons that respond to the left part of your visual field are grouped together. Neurons that respond to the right part are grouped together. The spatial arrangement of the world is preserved or mapped in the spatial arrangement of neural activity. This is an isomorphic representation. Feinberg and Malat argue that the capacity for such isomorphic representations, combined with systems for integrating information from different senses and for generating behavioral responses, provides the neural foundation for consciousness. And the first animals to develop these capacities, they suggest, were the early vertebrates of the Cambrian, along with possibly some arthropods, like the ancestors of modern insects and crustaceans. This would mean that consciousness is at least 500 million years old. It would mean that when a Cambrian fish swam through ancient seas, detecting movement with its lateral line and images with its primitive eyes, there may have been something it was like to be that fish, some subjective quality to its experience. Perhaps nothing like our rich, complex consciousness. Perhaps just the vaguest glimmers of awareness, the faintest flickers of sensation, but something. Not the complete darkness of unconscious information processing, but the first dawn of inner experience. Of course, we can never know for certain. Consciousness leaves no fossils. We can't directly observe what it was like to be a Cambrian organism. But we can make informed inferences based on neurobiology, based on behavior, based on the structures we see evolving. And the picture that emerges suggests that consciousness is ancient, that it evolved not once, but possibly multiple times in different lineages, and that it evolved because it conferred survival advantages. What advantage does consciousness provide? This is a deep question that we'll return to throughout our exploration. One possibility is that consciousness allows for more flexible, more adaptive behavior. An organism that merely follows pre-programmed responses to stimuli is limited in how it can respond to novel situations. But an organism that can integrate information from multiple senses, that can form a unified model of its environment, that can weigh different options and select behaviors based on that model, has far more behavioral flexibility. Consciousness, in this view, is what allows an organism to act as a unified whole, rather than as a collection of separate reflexes. Another possibility, suggested by neuroscientist Rodolfo Llinás and others, is that consciousness evolved hand in hand with movement, with motility. Consider the difference between a plant and an animal. A plant is rooted in place. It can respond to its environment by growing toward light or sinking roots toward water. But these responses can unfold slowly over time. An animal, however, must make rapid decisions about where to move, what to pursue, what to avoid. This requires predicting the consequences of different actions, requires maintaining a model of the environment that updates in real time, requires coordinating sensory input with motor output. All of this, Llinás argues, creates the need for what we experience as consciousness. Even a simple organism like a paramecium, a single-celled creature covered with cilia, shows surprisingly sophisticated behavior. It can sense gradients of chemicals in its environment, swimming toward nutrients and away from toxins. It can sense obstacles and back up, change direction, and try a new path. Some researchers argue this shows a primitive form of sentience, a basic ability to sense and respond that contains the seeds of what would become full-fledged consciousness in more complex organisms. Others argue that this is purely mechanistic, no different in principle from a thermostat sensing temperature and triggering a furnace. The line between life and non-life, between responsiveness and awareness, is not always easy to draw, but as we move forward in time from the Cambrian, as we watch nervous systems grow larger and more complex, as we see brains differentiate into distinct regions with specialized functions. The case for consciousness becomes stronger. Early fish developed cerebellums for coordinating movement, midbrains for processing sensory information, forebrains that would eventually become the seat of higher cognitive functions. With each elaboration, with each new capacity, the inner life of these creatures presumably grew richer and more complex. By about 200 million years ago, the basic vertebrate brain plan was well established. The brain consisted of three main regions: the hindbrain, controlling basic life functions and movement coordination; the midbrain, processing sensory information and controlling arousal; and the forebrain, increasingly involved in complex behaviors and eventually in cognition. This three-part structure persists in all modern vertebrates, from fish to amphibians to reptiles to birds to mammals. We all inherited it from common ancestors that lived hundreds of millions of years ago. But within this common plan, different lineages made different evolutionary innovations. The evolution of consciousness was not a single straight line from simple to complex. Rather, it was a branching tree with different animal groups developing different forms and perhaps different qualities of awareness. Birds evolved a structure called the pallium, which serves functions similar to the mammalian cortex, despite having a different anatomical organization. Octopuses, in a completely different lineage, evolved remarkably complex nervous systems with hundreds of millions of neurons, distributed not just in a central brain, but throughout their 8 arms. And mammals, the group we belong to, evolved something truly special: the neocortex. The neocortex is the wrinkled outer layer of the mammalian brain, the part that has expanded so dramatically in primates, and especially in humans. It's organized into 6 layers of neurons, with intricate patterns of connections, both within each layer and between layers, and between different regions of cortex. The neocortex is involved in sensory processing, in generating voluntary movements, in spatial reasoning, in language, in conscious thought. Its evolution marked a major leap in the sophistication of consciousness, though whether it's absolutely necessary for consciousness remains debated. Some researchers have argued that consciousness evolved specifically with the mammalian neocortex about 200 million years ago. The idea is that earlier vertebrates, while they might have had sensory awareness and behavioral sophistication, lacked true subjective experience, lacked qualia. Only with the neocortex did the full richness of phenomenal consciousness emerge, creating a private inner world of sensations and thoughts. Others argue this is too narrow, too mammal-centric. Birds, after all, show many signs of consciousness despite lacking a neocortex. They can recognize themselves in mirrors. At least some species like magpies can. They show complex social behaviors, problem-solving abilities, even tool use. Some parrots can learn human words and appear to use them meaningfully. All of this without a neocortex. This suggests that consciousness doesn't require one specific brain structure. Rather, it may be a property that can emerge from different neural organizations, as long as those organizations meet certain functional requirements. This brings us to an important concept in understanding consciousness: the idea of multiple realizability. This is the notion that a given function or property can be realized in different physical substrates. Consciousness, if it's a functional property of certain kinds of information processing systems, might be realized in a mammalian neocortex, in a bird's pallium, in an octopus's distributed nervous system, or even, hypothetically, in a sufficiently sophisticated artificial neural network. The specific hardware matters less than the patterns of information processing it supports. As we trace consciousness back through evolutionary time, we're not looking for a single moment when it suddenly appeared, like a light switch being flipped. Rather, we're seeing a gradual emergence, a dimmer knob slowly being turned up. The earliest nervous systems probably supported only the faintest glimmers of sensation. As nervous systems grew more complex, as they began to integrate information from multiple senses, as they began to form models of the environment and of the organism's own body, consciousness likely grew richer and more complex in tandem. There may have been many threshold crossings, many moments when new capacities came online, enabling new forms of awareness. By the time we reach the ancestors of modern mammals, perhaps 150 to 200 million years ago, we're almost certainly looking at conscious beings. These were small creatures, probably nocturnal, with large eyes adapted for seeing in dim light, keen hearing, and a well-developed sense of smell. Their brains, while tiny compared to modern mammalian brains, already possessed the basic mammalian plan, a neocortex for processing sensory information and generating complex behaviors, a limbic system for emotion and memory, a brainstem for controlling arousal and basic life functions. These early mammals lived in a world dominated by dinosaurs, and they survived by being small, quick, and clever. They needed to remember where food could be found, to recognize predators and hide from them, to navigate complex three-dimensional environments as they climbed through vegetation or scurried through burrows. All of this required sophisticated cognitive abilities, and supporting those abilities required consciousness. A mammal needed to be aware of its surroundings, aware of its own bodily state, aware of dangers and opportunities. It needed to feel fear and hunger and comfort. It needed the motivation that comes from conscious experience to drive its behavior. The evolution of consciousness in our ancestors was intimately tied to the evolution of emotion. The limbic system, a set of structures deep in the brain that includes the amygdala and hippocampus, appears to be crucial for emotional processing and for certain types of memory. When you feel afraid, your amygdala is activating. When you form a new memory of an event, your hippocampus is encoding it. These structures are ancient, present in all mammals and in modified forms in other vertebrates. They suggest that emotion and consciousness evolved together, that the felt quality of experience, the phenomenal aspect of consciousness, may be inseparable from the evaluative aspect, from the sense that some things are good and others bad, that some experiences are to be sought and others avoided. This makes evolutionary sense. A creature that merely processed information without feeling anything would have no reason to prefer one outcome over another, no motivation to act. But a creature that feels pleasure when it eats, pain when injured, fear when threatened, has powerful internal guides to behavior. Consciousness provides the carrot and stick that natural selection uses to shape behavior. The hedonic tone of experience, the fact that some experiences feel good and others feel bad, is what gives consciousness its functional role in guiding adaptive behavior. As we watch consciousness evolving, growing more sophisticated, spreading through different animal lineages, we see that it's not a luxury, not an epiphenomenon. It's a central feature of how complex nervous systems work, how they generate flexible, adaptive behavior in a changing and uncertain world. The question isn't really whether animals are conscious, but rather what kinds of consciousness they have, how rich and complex their inner lives are, how similar or different their experiences are from ours. Every creature with a nervous system inhabits its own unique sensory world, what the biologist Jakob von Uexküll called an Umwelt. A tick's Umwelt consists of chemical signals indicating the presence of a warm-blooded animal, mechanical signals indicating contact, and temperature signals indicating where to bite. That's the tick's world. A dog's Umwelt is dominated by smells, a rich olfactory landscape we can barely imagine. A bat's Umwelt includes echolocation, sound transformed into spatial maps. Each species, through the structure of its nervous system and sense organs, carves out its own slice of reality, its own conscious experience. But among all the animals that have evolved consciousness, among all the varied forms that awareness has taken, one species stands apart. One lineage took consciousness to unprecedented heights, developed capacities for thought and language and self-reflection that seem qualitatively different from anything else in nature. That species, of course, is us, Homo sapiens. And to understand human consciousness, we need to zoom in from the deep evolutionary past to the more recent story of how humans diverged from our closest relatives. If you could see your own neurons, watch them firing in intricate patterns as you think and feel and perceive, you'd be witnessing one of the most complex systems in the known universe. The human brain contains roughly 86 billion neurons, each one connected to thousands of others, forming a network of staggering intricacy. But this network doesn't create consciousness uniformly. Different regions of the brain play different roles, and understanding consciousness requires understanding this functional architecture. Let's start with the most basic requirement for consciousness: arousal. Before you can be conscious of anything specific, you need to be awake and alert, rather than asleep or comatose. This function is controlled by a network of structures in the brainstem and thalamus, collectively called the ascending arousal system. These structures release neurotransmitters that activate the cortex, maintaining wakefulness. Damage to these arousal systems can lead to coma, a state where consciousness is completely lost even though the cortex itself may be intact. The brainstem, the oldest part of the brain in evolutionary terms, controls the most fundamental aspects of life: breathing, heart rate, sleep-wake cycles. The fact that brainstem function is essential for consciousness shows that consciousness requires this basic foundation of life support. You can't be conscious if you're not alive, and the brainstem keeps you alive. Moving up from the brainstem, we reach the thalamus, a structure shaped roughly like two eggs joined at the center, sitting at the very core of the brain. The thalamus acts as a relay station, routing sensory information to the appropriate regions of cortex. With the exception of smell, every sense passes through the thalamus before reaching conscious awareness. Visual information from the eyes travels to the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus, which then sends it to the primary visual cortex. Sounds processed by the ears travel through the medial geniculate nucleus before reaching auditory cortex. Touch sensations travel through the ventral posterior nucleus. But the thalamus does more than just relay information. It also appears to play a role in gating what reaches consciousness. Not every sensory signal that arrives at the thalamus makes it to the cortex. Some are filtered out, deemed irrelevant or redundant. This filtering is part of what allows us to focus attention, to become consciously aware of some things while remaining unaware of others. The thalamus, in conjunction with the cortex, helps determine what we notice and what we ignore. Surrounding the thalamus and brainstem are structures of the limbic system, the hippocampus, crucial for forming new memories, the amygdala, involved in emotional processing, especially fear, the hypothalamus, regulating hunger, thirst, and hormones. These structures color our conscious experience with emotion and connect our present perceptions to our memories of the past. When you smell a scent that reminds you of childhood, it's your hippocampus linking the present sensation to old memories. When you feel a surge of fear at a sudden noise, it's your amygdala activating. These aren't separate from consciousness, they're integral to it, part of what makes experience feel meaningful and motivating, rather than neutral and abstract. Now we reach the cortex, the wrinkled outer layer of the brain. This is where things get especially interesting for understanding human consciousness. The cortex is divided into 4 main lobes, each with specialized functions. The occipital lobe at the back processes vision. The temporal lobes on the sides process sound and are involved in memory and object recognition. The parietal lobes toward the top process touch and spatial information. And the frontal lobes, the largest region in humans, are involved in movement, planning, decision-making, and many higher cognitive functions. Within each lobe, there's further specialization. The primary sensory areas receive input directly from the thalamus and process basic features of sensation. The primary visual cortex, for instance, responds to simple features like edges and orientations. Neurons in this area are organized retinotopically, meaning the spatial layout of the retina is preserved in the spatial layout of the cortex. If you're looking at something on the right side of your visual field, neurons on the left side of your primary visual cortex are firing. If you're looking at something up high, neurons in the lower part of primary visual cortex are firing. From these primary areas, information flows to association areas, where more complex processing occurs. Visual information flows forward into temporal cortex, where objects are recognized, and upward into parietal cortex, where spatial relationships are processed. Auditory information flows from primary auditory cortex into areas that recognize specific sounds, speech, music. These association areas integrate information, finding patterns and meaning in the raw data provided by the senses. For consciousness to occur, there must be not just processing in these individual areas, but integration across areas. A single region of cortex processing one type of information in isolation probably doesn't create consciousness. What creates consciousness is the binding together of information from multiple regions into a unified experience. When you look at a red ball rolling across the floor, different features of this scene are processed in different places. Color in one area of visual cortex, shape in another, movement in another. Yet, you don't experience separate color, shape, and movement. You experience an integrated whole, a red ball rolling. This binding, this integration, is one of the key mysteries and key features of consciousness. How does this integration happen? This is one of the central questions in neuroscience. One influential idea is that synchronization of neural firing across different brain regions may be crucial. When neurons in different areas fire in synchrony, oscillating together at particular frequencies like 40 Hz in the gamma band, this may bind their activities together into a unified representation. Neural synchronization could be the brain's way of tagging different pieces of information as belonging together, as parts of a single conscious experience. But integration alone isn't enough. The brain integrates information during sleep, during dreamless sleep, where consciousness is absent or minimal. What distinguishes conscious integration from unconscious integration? This is where theories start to diverge, and we'll explore different theoretical frameworks later. But at a neurological level, several features seem important. One is the involvement of widespread networks spanning multiple brain regions. Consciousness appears to correlate with global patterns of brain activity, not just local processing in one region. Studies using neuroimaging techniques like functional MRI have shown that when people consciously perceive a stimulus, there's activation not just in sensory cortices, but across a broad network, including parietal and frontal regions. In contrast, unconsciously processed stimuli may activate sensory cortex, but fail to produce this widespread activation. Another important feature appears to be recurrent processing, feedback connections that allow information to flow, not just forward from sensory areas to higher areas, but also backward from higher areas to sensory areas. These feedback connections may allow higher level interpretations to influence lower level processing, creating a kind of dialogue between different levels of the cortical hierarchy. Consciousness, in this view, emerges from the reverberating activity in these recurrent loops. The prefrontal cortex, the very front part of the frontal lobe, has been particularly implicated in consciousness, though its exact role remains debated. This region is massively expanded in humans compared to other primates, and it's involved in many higher cognitive functions: working memory, planning, decision-making, cognitive control. Some theories propose that prefrontal activity is essential for consciousness, that it's the prefrontal cortex broadcasting information widely across the brain that creates the global availability characteristic of conscious states. Other theories argue that prefrontal cortex is more involved in cognitive access to information and in reporting about consciousness rather than in consciousness itself. Interestingly, studies of patients with brain damage have provided crucial insights. Damage to the prefrontal cortex, while it can cause severe impairments in planning and personality, often doesn't eliminate consciousness itself. Patients may still be aware, still experience sensations and emotions, even if their ability to act on that awareness is impaired. This suggests that prefrontal cortex may not be absolutely necessary for consciousness, though it's certainly important for the rich, flexible consciousness that humans typically enjoy. In contrast, damage to a more posterior region, called the posterior cortical hot zone, which includes parts of parietal, temporal, and occipital cortex, appears to more directly affect conscious experience. Lesions here can cause specific losses of conscious content, inability to consciously see color or movement or faces. This has led some researchers to propose that the neural correlates of consciousness, the minimal neural mechanisms sufficient for conscious experience, may be primarily located in this posterior region, rather than in frontal cortex. The quest to identify the neural correlates of consciousness, often abbreviated NCC, has been a major focus of neuroscience research for the past few decades. The idea is to find the specific brain activity that corresponds to conscious experience, that is both necessary and sufficient for consciousness to occur. Francis Crick and Christoph Koch, pioneers in this field, proposed that we should focus on finding the NCC as a tractable scientific problem, setting aside for the moment the deeper philosophical puzzles. What researchers have found is that different aspects of consciousness have different neural correlates. There's the NCC for the background state of consciousness, for being awake and aware versus asleep or anesthetized. This appears to depend on the arousal systems in the brainstem and thalamus, plus the general level of activity and connectivity in the cortex. There's the NCC for specific contents of consciousness, for the particular things you're aware of at any given moment. This appears to depend on activity in specific sensory and association areas, plus the integration of that activity into broader networks. Modern brain imaging techniques have revolutionized our ability to study these correlates. Functional MRI measures blood flow changes that reflect neural activity, allowing us to see which brain regions are active during different tasks or experiences. EEG measures electrical activity from the scalp, tracking neural rhythms and the timing of responses. MEG measures magnetic fields produced by neural currents. Together, these techniques let us watch the brain as it generates consciousness, identifying patterns that correlate with conscious versus unconscious processing. One classic paradigm for studying consciousness uses binocular rivalry. If you present a different image to each eye, you don't see both images superimposed. Instead, your consciousness alternates between them. You might see the image presented to the left eye for a few seconds, then the image presented to the right eye, then back to the left, even though the physical stimulation remains constant. This provides a way to separate neural activity related to the physical stimulus from neural activity related to conscious perception. Researchers have found that activity in higher visual areas and in parietal and frontal cortices tracks what people consciously perceive rather than what's physically presented, supporting the idea that these regions are part of the NCC for visual consciousness. Another approach involves using anesthesia to manipulate consciousness directly. By carefully titrating anesthetic drugs, researchers can study the transition from consciousness to unconsciousness and back. What they've found is that as consciousness fades, there's a breakdown in the communication between different brain regions. The brain becomes more functionally fragmented, with different regions operating in isolation, rather than as an integrated whole. This supports theories emphasizing integration and communication as key to consciousness. Yet, for all these advances, we still don't have complete answers. We can identify brain activity that correlates with consciousness, but correlation isn't explanation. We still don't fully understand how and why this particular pattern of neural activity generates subjective experience. We're getting better at predicting when someone will be conscious based on brain activity. But the deeper question of how neurons produce qualia remains elusive. This is sometimes called the explanatory gap. We can explain how the brain processes information, how it integrates sensory inputs, how it generates behaviors. But there seems to be a gap between these functional explanations and the existence of subjective experience. Why isn't all this information processing happening in the dark without anyone home to witness it? Why is there something it feels like to be a brain? Some philosophers and neuroscientists believe this explanatory gap will eventually be closed as our neuroscience becomes more sophisticated. As we understand the brain in ever greater detail, the mystery will dissolve. Others believe the gap is fundamental, that consciousness involves something beyond physical processes, or at least something that can't be fully captured by our current scientific frameworks. We'll return to these deep questions later in our exploration. For now, the key insight is that consciousness depends on a complex interplay of brain systems. It requires arousal systems to maintain wakefulness. It requires sensory systems to gather information about the world. It requires memory systems to connect present to past. It requires emotional systems to give experience its felt quality. And it requires integration across all these systems, knitting together diverse streams of processing into the unified field of awareness we experience moment to moment. The human brain didn't invent these systems from scratch. We inherited most of them from our mammalian ancestors, who inherited them in turn from earlier vertebrates. The basic architecture, the fundamental building blocks, are ancient. But the human brain elaborated on this ancient architecture in specific ways, expanding certain regions, refining certain circuits, enabling new forms of cognition and consciousness. To understand these human-specific features, we need to look at our evolutionary history more recent than the hundreds of millions of years we've covered so far. We need to look at the last few million years, at the story of how we became human. Look into the eyes of a chimpanzee, our closest living relative, and you'll see something unmistakably familiar. There's someone there looking back at you, an intelligence, a personality, a self. Yet, for all that similarity, for all that we share roughly 98% of our DNA with chimpanzees, there's also something different. Humans crossed a threshold that other apes did not, developing capacities for language, for abstract thought, for cumulative culture that seem to set us apart. Understanding human consciousness means understanding both what we share with our ape relatives and what makes us unique. The evidence for consciousness in great apes, the group that includes chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, and orangutans, is substantial. These animals show complex social behaviors, form long-lasting relationships, display emotions that seem clearly recognizable: joy, grief, anger, compassion. They use and even make tools. They can learn symbols and communicate with human caregivers using sign language or keyboards. Some can plan for future events, demonstrating foresight. All of this suggests rich mental lives, sophisticated cognitive processes, conscious awareness. But perhaps the most striking evidence comes from a simple test devised by psychologist Gordon Gallup in 1970. He placed mirrors in the enclosures of chimpanzees and observed their reactions. At first, the chimps treated their reflections as if they were other chimpanzees, displaying social behaviors toward the mirror. But after a few days of exposure, their behavior changed. They began to use the mirror to inspect parts of their own bodies they couldn't normally see, like their teeth or the tops of their heads. They would make faces at the mirror, watching the reflection as they did so. To confirm that the chimps really recognized themselves, Gallup devised the mark test. While the chimps were anesthetized for routine medical care, he painted odorless red marks on their eyebrows and the tops of their ears, places they couldn't see without a mirror. When they woke up and looked in the mirror, they immediately reached up to touch the marks on their own bodies, not on the mirror. They recognized that the reflection was of themselves, not another chimp. This behavior, mirror self-recognition, is considered a strong indicator of self-awareness, the ability to recognize oneself as a distinct individual separate from others. It suggests a form of metacognition, thinking about one's own thoughts and body. It's a capacity that emerges in human children around 18 to 24 months of age. And among non-human animals, it's been convincingly demonstrated only in great apes, though there's intriguing evidence for a few other species like elephants, dolphins, and magpies. The fact that gorillas, despite being great apes, often fail the mirror test has puzzled researchers. One prominent gorilla named Coco, famous for learning American Sign Language, did pass the test, but many other gorillas have not. The leading explanation is that gorillas have a strong cultural taboo against direct eye contact, which they consider aggressive. This may make them uncomfortable with the prolonged looking required for mirror self-recognition. It's a reminder that failing a test for consciousness doesn't necessarily mean lacking consciousness. It might just mean the test isn't suitable for that species. Monkeys, the broader group of primates that includes species like macaques and capuchins, consistently fail the mirror test even after years of exposure to mirrors. They continue to treat their reflections as other monkeys. This suggests a fundamental difference in self-awareness between monkeys and great apes. Monkeys may be conscious, may have subjective experiences, but they seem to lack the capacity to recognize themselves as distinct entities, to become objects of their own attention. This divide between great apes and other primates points to something that evolved relatively recently, probably within the last 10 to 15 million years, after the lineage leading to great apes split from the lineage leading to other Old World monkeys. What neurological changes underlie this difference? The answer isn't entirely clear, but it likely involves the further elaboration of brain networks supporting self-representation and metacognition. Self-awareness probably isn't a single capacity, but rather a collection of related abilities that come in degrees. There's bodily self-awareness, knowing where your body is in space and distinguishing it from other objects. There's self-recognition, identifying yourself in mirrors or photographs. There's autobiographical memory, the ability to remember your own past experiences and situate them in a narrative of your life. There's theory of mind, the ability to attribute mental states to yourself and to others. And there's metacognition, the ability to think about your own thinking, to monitor and control your own cognitive processes. Great apes show at least some capacity for all of these. Chimpanzees can remember sequences of events and show some episodic-like memory, though perhaps not as rich as human autobiographical memory. They show clear signs of theory of mind, understanding that others have perceptions and knowledge different from their own. A chimp will selectively inform another chimp about food locations if the other chimp wasn't present when the food was hidden. This suggests understanding that the other chimp doesn't know what the first chimp knows. Orangutans have demonstrated impressive problem-solving abilities, sometimes planning several steps ahead to achieve a goal. They can use tools in sophisticated ways, modifying objects to serve specific purposes. Bonobos show remarkable emotional sensitivity, consoling group members who are distressed, suggesting empathy and emotional awareness. All of this points to complex inner lives, to consciousness that includes not just basic awareness, but self-awareness and social awareness as well. Yet for all these impressive capacities, there's something qualitatively different about human consciousness. The most obvious difference is language. Humans are the only species that uses language naturally, a symbolic system that allows us to express an unlimited range of thoughts and ideas. While great apes can learn symbols, their spontaneous communication remains fairly limited compared to even a 3-year-old human child. A young child generates novel sentences they've never heard before, combining words according to grammatical rules to express new ideas. This capacity for generative language seems unique to humans. Language transforms consciousness in profound ways. It allows us to think in words, to carry on internal dialogues, to reason abstractly about things that aren't present. It allows us to share our thoughts with others, to build on each other's ideas, to create cumulative culture that grows across generations. Every human alive today benefits from insights and inventions that occurred hundreds or thousands of years ago, preserved and transmitted through language and culture. This cultural ratchet, this ability to build on the past, is uniquely human and depends on our linguistic abilities. But language is also intertwined with other uniquely human cognitive capacities. One is mental time travel, the ability to vividly imagine the past and future. While other animals may have some capacity to remember the past and anticipate the future, humans seem to do this with a richness and flexibility that's unmatched. You can mentally relive a conversation from years ago, projecting yourself back to that moment and re-experiencing it. You can imagine scenarios that have never happened, planning for possibilities, weighing alternatives. This ability to move freely through mental time, disconnecting from the immediate present, is a key feature of human consciousness. Related to this is our capacity for abstract thought and reasoning. Humans can think about things that don't physically exist. Numbers, justice, hypothetical situations, logical relationships. We can reason about general principles rather than specific instances. We can engage in what's called counterfactual thinking, imagining how things could have gone differently if circumstances had changed. All of this requires moving beyond concrete perceptions and memories to operate in a more abstract mental space. Another distinctive human capacity is what researchers call theory of mind, though we share a simpler version of this with other great apes. Theory of mind involves understanding that other individuals have mental states, beliefs, desires, intentions that may differ from your own. Young children develop an explicit understanding of this around age 4, when they can pass false belief tasks. For instance, if a child sees a character put a marble in a box, then sees a second character move the marble to a basket while the first character is away, the child can predict that the first character will still look for the marble in the box, because that's where they believe it is, even though the child knows it's actually in the basket. This ability to attribute false beliefs to others, to understand that someone else's mental representation of the world may differ from reality, is a sophisticated form of social cognition. It allows us to predict others' behavior based on their beliefs, rather than just on reality. It's foundational for human social life, for cooperation, for teaching, for all the complex social interactions that characterize human societies. While great apes show some capacity for theory of mind, they seem to struggle with false belief understanding in the way that human children master. The expansion of the prefrontal cortex is often cited as the neurological basis for these uniquely human capacities. The prefrontal cortex is proportionally much larger in humans than in other primates, taking up a greater fraction of the total brain. This region is involved in executive functions, planning, working memory, cognitive control, decision-making. It's also crucial for social cognition, for representing mental states, for regulating behavior based on social norms and long-term goals. Studies comparing human brains to those of other great apes have found that certain prefrontal regions are particularly expanded in humans. These include areas involved in language processing, like Broca's area, and areas involved in complex reasoning and abstract thought. There are also differences in white matter, the connections between brain regions. Humans have more extensive long-range connections, linking different parts of cortex, which may support the integration of information across distant brain regions. But it's not just about size or connectivity. There are also cellular and molecular differences. Human neurons appear to have more complex dendritic trees, more elaborate branching patterns that may allow each neuron to integrate information from more sources. There are differences in the expression of certain genes in human brains compared to chimpanzee brains. Differences that affect neural development, synaptic function, and neural metabolism. Some researchers have identified human-specific genes and gene variants that emerged after our lineage split from that of chimpanzees, and that are expressed in the brain during development. One gene in particular, FOXP2, has received a lot of attention because of its connection to language. Mutations in FOXP2 cause a specific language impairment in humans. The human version of this gene differs from the chimpanzee version in ways that appear to have been positively selected, meaning evolution favored these changes. While FOXP2 isn't a language gene in any simple sense, it's involved in neural circuits underlying fine motor control, including the motor control needed for speech. This suggests that genetic changes affecting brain development and function were crucial for the emergence of human-specific cognitive abilities. The evolutionary timeline for these changes is still being worked out, but the broad strokes are clear. The human lineage diverged from the lineage of our closest living relatives, chimps and bonobos, about 6 to 7 million years ago. For several million years after that split, our ancestors remained relatively similar to other apes in brain size and presumably in cognitive abilities. But starting around 2 to 3 million years ago, brain size began to increase, more than tripling from the ape-like brains of early hominins to the large brains of modern humans. This expansion wasn't just a scaling up of the same structure. Different brain regions expanded at different rates. The frontal lobe grew disproportionately, and within the frontal lobe, prefrontal regions showed the greatest expansion. The temporal lobe also grew substantially, and areas involved in language processing emerged or were elaborated. The result was a brain that, while built on the same basic plan as other primate brains, had significantly different proportions and capabilities. Hand in hand with this neurological evolution went behavioral and cultural evolution. Our ancestors began making stone tools around 3 million years ago, progressively developing more sophisticated tool technologies. They controlled fire, allowing cooking, which in turn may have supported brain expansion by providing more easily digestible, energy-rich food. They developed more complex social groups, requiring greater social intelligence. And at some point, they developed language. When exactly language emerged is hotly debated. Some argue it was a relatively late development, perhaps only in the last 100,000 years, with the emergence of anatomically modern Homo sapiens. Others argue for earlier origins, perhaps with earlier species, like Homo heidelbergensis, or even Homo erectus. The evidence is indirect, based on things like the anatomy of the vocal tract, the structure of the inner ear, the presence of Broca's area in fossil endocasts, and the complexity of tools and other cultural artifacts. A species that makes sophisticated tools, that uses fire, that possibly creates art, likely has some capacity for symbolic thought and communication, even if not full-blown language as modern humans have. What seems clear is that the development of language was transformative, creating new forms of consciousness. With language came the ability to name and categorize, to create concepts that could be shared and refined across generations. With language came the ability to tell stories, to create narratives that gave meaning to experience. With language came the ability to reason explicitly, to debate and argue, to build systems of knowledge. Some researchers, like linguist Terence Deacon, have argued that language didn't just enhance pre-existing human consciousness, but fundamentally restructured it. Before language, our ancestors might have had consciousness similar to that of modern great apes, aware, intelligent, social, but tied to the concrete and immediate. With language came the ability to mentally represent abstract concepts, to think in symbols, to create what Deacon calls a symbolic species. This symbolic consciousness is qualitatively different from non-symbolic consciousness, opening up new ways of experiencing and understanding the world. Other researchers are more cautious about claiming a sharp discontinuity. They note that many cognitive abilities thought to be uniquely human, when tested carefully, show at least rudimentary forms in other great apes, or even other animals. The differences may be more of degree than of kind, with humans having more elaborated versions of capacities present in simpler forms in our relatives. Still, degree can matter. Water at 99 degrees and water at 101 degrees differ only by 2 degrees, but one is liquid and the other is steam, a qualitative phase transition, resulting from a quantitative change. However we characterize the difference, there's no question that human consciousness has properties not found in other known species. We're aware not just of the world and of ourselves, but of the fact that we're aware. We can contemplate our own existence, wonder about the nature of consciousness itself. We can engage in philosophy, science, art, endeavors that require stepping back from immediate experience to reflect on it, analyze it, represent it in new forms. This recursive, reflective quality of human consciousness seems to be one of its defining features. As we trace the evolution of human consciousness from ape ancestors through various hominin species to modern Homo sapiens, we're seeing a story of gradual elaboration punctuated by key innovations. The capacity for self-awareness emerged in great apes. The capacity for advanced tool use and social learning emerged in early hominins. The capacity for symbolic thought and language emerged in later hominins and was fully realized in modern humans. Each of these developments built on what came before, creating new layers and new possibilities for consciousness. But this evolutionary story, crucial as it is, doesn't fully answer the question of how consciousness works or why it exists. For that, we need to zoom back in, not to evolutionary time, but to individual development and to the moment-by-moment workings of the brain. We need to look at what happens when a brain generates conscious experience, at the neural and cognitive processes involved. And we need to grapple with the philosophical puzzles that consciousness presents, questions that go beyond what any neuroscience experiment can directly answer. close your eyes for a moment and picture a lemon. Not a real lemon sitting in front of you, but an imagined one. Notice how you can conjure it in your mind's eye. See its yellow skin, imagine the texture of its surface, perhaps even imagine the tart taste if you were to bite into it. This ability to create mental representations, to think in symbols and images, is one of the hallmarks of human consciousness, and it's intimately connected to the most distinctively human cognitive tool we possess: language. Language is so fundamental to human experience that it's hard to imagine consciousness without it. Most of our thoughts, at least the ones we're explicitly aware of, come to us in words. We talk to ourselves internally, rehearsing conversations, working through problems, commenting on our experiences. We organize memories as narratives, stories we tell ourselves about our lives. We construct our very sense of identity through language, through the descriptions and labels we apply to ourselves. The origin of language is one of the great mysteries in human evolution, right alongside the origin of consciousness itself. In fact, many researchers believe these two mysteries are intimately connected, that the evolution of language fundamentally transformed human consciousness, enabling new forms of thought that were previously impossible. To understand human consciousness, then, we need to understand language and its role in shaping how we think and experience the world. Language, at its core, is a system of symbols. Words stand for things, represent concepts, denote categories. The word dog represents the category of dogs, calling to mind all the features associated with dogs, even when no dog is present. This symbolic capacity allows us to think about things that aren't immediately perceptible, to refer to past events, future possibilities, abstract concepts. It frees our minds from the concrete present. But language is more than just labels for things. It has grammar, syntax, rules for combining words in meaningful ways. This grammatical structure allows us to express complex ideas, to articulate relationships between concepts, to convey nuanced meanings. The difference between the dog chased the cat and the cat chased the dog is entirely in the word order, the grammatical structure. That structure carries meaning, information about who did what to whom. This combinatorial productivity, the ability to generate an infinite variety of sentences from a finite set of words and grammatical rules, is one of the defining features of human language. Every day, you produce and understand sentences you've never encountered before. This isn't memorization or pattern matching in any simple sense. It's a generative capacity, the ability to create and comprehend novel linguistic structures on the fly. Where did this remarkable capacity come from? The fossil record can't tell us directly, since language doesn't fossilize. But there are clues. The anatomy of the vocal tract leaves traces in the skeleton, particularly in the shape of the base of the skull and the position of the hyoid bone in the throat. Modern humans have a descended larynx, which allows us to produce the wide range of vowel sounds used in speech. Neanderthals, our extinct cousins, appear to have had similar vocal anatomy, suggesting they may have been capable of speech. The brain also leaves clues. Although soft tissue doesn't fossilize, the inside of the skull takes an impression of the brain's surface, creating what's called an endocast. In Homo sapiens, and even in earlier species like Homo erectus, these endocasts show bulges that correspond to Broca's area and Wernicke's area, regions involved in language production and comprehension in modern humans. This suggests the neural hardware for language was emerging hundreds of thousands of years ago. But having the capacity for language doesn't mean language existed. That requires a cultural innovation, the actual invention and transmission of a communication system. When this happened is fiercely debated. Some point to evidence of symbolic behavior, like the use of ochre pigments and the creation of abstract engravings, appearing around 100,000 years ago in Africa. Others point to even earlier evidence, suggesting some form of language may have existed in Homo heidelbergensis or Homo erectus, species that lived several 100,000 years ago. What seems clear is that by the time modern humans began spreading out of Africa around 70,000 years ago, they possessed language. The archaeological record from this period shows a fluorescence of symbolic expression. Cave paintings, carved figurines, complex burial practices, sophisticated tools. All of this suggests symbolic thought and communication. The sudden emergence of these behaviors has been called the Great Leap Forward, or the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, though recent evidence suggests the transition may have been more gradual than revolutionary. However it happened, the acquisition of language transformed human cognition and consciousness. Linguist and anthropologist Terence Deacon has argued that learning language actually changes how the brain develops and functions. Children raised without language, tragic cases of severe neglect, show profound cognitive deficits that go beyond mere communication. They struggle with abstract reasoning, with planning, with many of the higher cognitive functions that seem natural to normally developing humans. This suggests language isn't just a tool we use with an unchanged brain. It's a tool that reshapes the brain itself. How does language reshape thought? One possibility is that language provides a format for thought, a medium in which ideas can be represented and manipulated. Before language, thoughts might have been more image-based, more tied to sensory representations. With language, thoughts can be abstract, can involve concepts that have no sensory correlate. You can think about justice, or freedom, or infinity, concepts that can't be visualized in any straightforward way, but can be represented linguistically. Language also allows for recursive embedding, the ability to nest ideas within ideas. You can think, I believe that she thinks that he knows, with each level of embedding adding another layer of meta-representation. This recursive capacity may be unique to human language and thought, enabling the kind of complex social reasoning and planning that characterizes human cognition. Another crucial function of language is its role in working memory. Working memory is the ability to hold information in mind temporarily, to manipulate it, to use it in reasoning and problem solving. In humans, verbal working memory, the ability to maintain information in a phonological loop by silently rehearsing it, is a key component of this system. You can remember a phone number by repeating it to yourself. You can reason through a math problem by talking yourself through the steps. Language provides a scaffold for thought, allowing us to maintain and manipulate more complex mental contents than we otherwise could. Language also enables us to share our thoughts with others, creating what some researchers call a shared intentionality or collective consciousness. Through language, we can align our mental states, ensure we're thinking about the same things, build common ground. This is essential for human cooperation, for teaching, for all forms of cultural transmission. When a parent teaches a child to use a tool, when a teacher explains a concept to a student, when collaborators work together on a project, language is the medium that allows mental contents to flow from one mind to another. Some researchers have gone further, arguing that language doesn't just facilitate thought, but actually creates certain forms of thought. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, in its strong form, proposes that the language you speak determines how you think, that different languages create different conceptual worlds. While the strong version of this hypothesis is generally rejected, a weaker version, linguistic relativity, is well supported. The language you speak does influence certain aspects of how you think, how you categorize experience, what you find easy or difficult to conceptualize. For instance, some languages have grammatical gender, requiring you to classify every noun as masculine or feminine. Speakers of such languages appear to associate objects with gender-related properties more readily than speakers of languages without grammatical gender. Some languages have absolute spatial terms rather than relative ones, requiring you to say, "The cup is north of the plate," rather than "The cup is to the left of the plate." Speakers of such languages maintain better orientation, always knowing which direction is north because their language requires it. These differences don't mean speakers of different languages live in completely different conceptual worlds, but they suggest language does shape aspects of cognition and potentially conscious experience. The categories your language provides, the distinctions it forces you to make, the ones it allows you to ignore, all of this structures your thought in subtle but real ways. The relationship between language and consciousness is also evident in how we construct narratives. Humans are storytelling creatures. We don't just remember events as isolated facts. We weave them into narratives, creating coherent stories with beginnings, middles, and ends. These narratives give meaning to experience, explain why things happen, connect past to present to future. And narratives are fundamentally linguistic constructions. Your sense of self, your identity, is largely narrative. You understand yourself as a character in an ongoing story, with a past history and a future trajectory. When you think about who you are, you're drawing on autobiographical memories that are organized narratively and often stored in linguistic form. People with damage to language areas of the brain, or to regions supporting autobiographical memory, often have disrupted senses of self, suggesting the linguistic narrative is crucial for self-consciousness. But language is also linked to consciousness in a more immediate way. Many philosophers and cognitive scientists have noted that much of our conscious thought is linguistic, takes the form of internal speech. When you're working through a problem, making a decision, reflecting on your feelings, there's often a stream of words running through your mind. This inner voice, this internal monologue, seems to be a key feature of wakeful human consciousness. Yet, not everyone experiences this inner voice to the same degree. Some people report constant internal speech, a non-stop verbal commentary on their thoughts and experiences. Others report mostly visual or abstract thinking with little verbal content. And some individuals, a surprisingly large minority, according to recent surveys, report no internal monologue at all. Their thinking is non-verbal, perhaps image-based or conceptual, but not worded. This variation raises fascinating questions about the diversity of conscious experience, even among humans. Despite these variations, there's general agreement that language is transformative for consciousness. It enables symbolic thought, abstract reasoning, complex communication. It structures memory and identity. It creates a shared cognitive space where minds can meet and build on each other's ideas. The human consciousness we experience today is in large part a linguistically structured consciousness, different in kind from the consciousness of our pre-linguistic ancestors and from the consciousness of other animals. But with these cognitive superpowers come peculiar vulnerabilities. Language allows us to worry about the future, to ruminate about the past, to create elaborate fears about things that may never happen. It allows us to construct negative narratives about ourselves, to engage in harsh self-criticism, to imagine social judgments that may not exist. The same capacity that frees us from the present moment can also trap us in maladaptive loops of thinking, contributing to anxiety, depression, and other mental health challenges unique to linguistic beings. The relationship between language and consciousness also raises profound questions about non-linguistic consciousness. What is it like to be conscious without language? Do infants, before they acquire language, have a different form of consciousness? Do people with profound language impairments still have full subjective experience? And what about animals who lack human language, but clearly have sophisticated cognition and apparent consciousness? These questions don't have simple answers, but they highlight that language, while transformative, isn't identical to consciousness. You can lose language through stroke and still be conscious. Infants are conscious before they speak. Animals are conscious without linguistic symbols. What language does is add layers to consciousness, enabling forms of thought and self-awareness that build on, but don't replace, more basic forms of awareness. As we continue to explore human consciousness, we need to hold both truths simultaneously. That language is central to human consciousness as we experience it, and that consciousness is a broader phenomenon that exists in non-linguistic forms as well. Human consciousness is linguistically enriched consciousness, consciousness that has been transformed by the capacity for symbolic thought and communication. Understanding this transformation helps us understand what makes human consciousness distinctive, while recognizing that the fundamental mystery of consciousness, of how and why subjective experience exists at all, goes deeper than language. Imagine you could build a perfect replica of yourself, atom for atom, neuron for neuron. This replica would have the same brain structure, the same patterns of neural connectivity, the same biochemistry. It would behave exactly as you do, speak the same words, make the same decisions. But here's the question: would it be conscious? Would there be something it's like to be this replica? Or would it be what philosophers call a zombie, a being that looks and acts conscious, but has no inner experience, no subjective awareness? This thought experiment, introduced by philosopher David Chalmers, is meant to illustrate what he famously called the hard problem of consciousness. The hard problem is the problem of explaining why and how physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experience, to the felt quality of consciousness. It's the problem of explaining qualia, the intrinsic subjective qualities of experiences like the redness of red or the painfulness of pain. Contrast this with what Chalmers called the easy problems of consciousness, though easy is relative and perhaps misleading. The easy problems are things like explaining how the brain integrates information from different senses, how it distinguishes self from world, how it controls attention, how it generates reports about mental states. These are difficult problems, certainly, but they seem tractable in principle. we can imagine explaining them in terms of neural mechanisms, information processing, computational algorithms. The hard problem is different. Even if we fully explained all the functional aspects of consciousness, all the information processing and behavior, there would still be a further question. Why is all this processing accompanied by experience? Why doesn't it happen in the dark, without any subjective dimension? This is the explanatory gap, the seeming impossibility of deriving facts about subjective experience from facts about objective physical processes. To see why this seems like such a deep problem, consider color. When light of a particular wavelength enters your eye, it triggers a cascade of neural events. Photoreceptors in the retina respond to the light, sending signals to retinal ganglion cells, which send signals through the optic nerve to the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus, which sends signals to the primary visual cortex. From there, information flows through multiple visual processing areas, eventually allowing you to recognize objects, navigate space, guide actions. We can explain all of this in terms of neural circuitry and information processing. We can even predict which wavelengths of light will cause which patterns of neural firing. But none of this explains why the processing of light around 700 nanometers is accompanied by the subjective experience of redness. Why does it feel like anything at all? This is the hard problem for color experience, and similar questions arise for every other aspect of consciousness. Some philosophers and scientists reject the hard problem, arguing it's based on confused thinking or false assumptions. They might argue that consciousness just is a certain kind of information processing, and once we fully explain the processing, we've explained consciousness. There's nothing left over, no further mystery. The appearance of an explanatory gap is an illusion, a failure to fully understand the implications of our scientific explanations. Daniel Dennett, a prominent philosopher of mind, has argued this position forcefully. He suggests that qualia, the supposed subjective qualities that resist explanation, don't actually exist as we intuitively think they do. What we call qualia are actually dispositions to make certain judgments and discriminations, and these can be fully explained functionally. The intuition that there's something more, some ineffable subjective quality beyond function, is a kind of illusion created by the way we introspect and think about our own minds. Others disagree, arguing the hard problem is real and points to genuine limits of physicalist explanations of consciousness. Some, like Chalmers himself, adopt a form of dualism, arguing that consciousness involves non-physical properties, or that it requires expanding our fundamental ontology beyond purely physical facts. Perhaps consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality, like mass or charge, something that can't be reduced to more basic physical properties. Another response is to bite the bullet and accept that, while the hard problem is real, it may be unsolvable, at least with our current conceptual frameworks. Maybe consciousness is something that can't be fully explained, that must simply be accepted as a brute fact. Philosopher Colin McGinn has argued for this Mysterianist position, suggesting that human cognitive faculties may be fundamentally incapable of understanding consciousness, just as a dog's cognitive faculties are incapable of understanding quantum mechanics. Still, others seek middle ground, arguing that the hard problem reveals something important about the nature of consciousness without requiring us to abandon physicalism. Perhaps what's needed is not different physics, but different concepts, better ways of thinking about the relationship between objective processes and subjective experience. Perhaps the explanatory gap exists not because consciousness is non-physical, but because our current conceptual schemes for understanding the physical don't capture all relevant aspects. One influential attempt to bridge this gap is the idea of taking consciousness as a fundamental property and developing psychophysical laws, systematic relationships between physical processes and conscious experiences. Just as physics has fundamental laws relating mass, energy, and force, perhaps we need fundamental laws relating neural processes to phenomenal states. This wouldn't eliminate the mystery entirely, just as fundamental physical laws don't eliminate the mystery of why the universe obeys those particular laws. But it would put consciousness on firmer scientific footing, making it something we can study and theorize about, even if we can't fully explain it away. The hard problem also connects to questions about the unity of consciousness. When you look at a scene, you have a single unified experience containing colors, shapes, sounds, perhaps smells, all experienced together as parts of one perceptual field. But in the brain, these different features are processed in different locations by different neural populations. Color is processed in one area of visual cortex, shape in another, motion in yet another. Sound is processed in auditory cortex, far from visual areas. How do all these separate processes come together into one unified experience? This is called the binding problem, and it's related to the hard problem because it highlights how mysterious the subjective unity of consciousness is. We don't experience separate color consciousness and shape consciousness that somehow combine. We experience an integrated whole from the start. Understanding how neural processes give rise to this unity is part of understanding consciousness itself. Another deep puzzle is the question of what's called the knowledge argument, introduced by philosopher Frank Jackson. Imagine Mary, a brilliant neuroscientist who knows everything there is to know about the physical processes involved in color vision. She knows all the facts about wavelengths of light, about retinal cells and neural pathways, about visual cortex and color processing. But Mary has lived her entire life in a black and white room and has never actually seen colors. One day, she steps outside and sees a red tomato for the first time. The question, does Mary learn something new? It seems obvious that she does. She learns what red looks like, the subjective quality of the color experience. But she already knew all the physical facts about color vision, so what she learned must be a non-physical fact. A fact about phenomenal consciousness that goes beyond physical facts. This suggests consciousness involves something more than just physical processes, something that can only be known through direct experience. Of course, this argument has been challenged. Some argue Mary doesn't actually learn any new facts. She just gains a new ability, the ability to recognize and imagine red. Others argue that she does learn something new, but that it's still a physical fact, just one that couldn't be fully grasped through purely descriptive knowledge. The debate continues, but the knowledge argument highlights the special status of first-person subjective knowledge. There's something about conscious experience that seems to resist third-person objective description. These philosophical puzzles aren't just abstract games. They have real implications for how we think about consciousness in practice. Consider the question of whether animals are conscious. If consciousness is purely functional, if it's just a matter of the right kind of information processing, then we can ask whether an animal's nervous system implements that kind of processing. We can look for neural correlates, behavioral indicators, functional capacities. But if the hard problem is real, if there's something about consciousness that goes beyond function, then it's harder to know. We can observe that an animal behaves as if it's in pain, that its nervous system processes pain signals. But does it feel pain? Is there something it's like to be that animal? Without access to its subjective experience, we can't be certain. Similar questions arise for artificial intelligence. As AI systems become more sophisticated, as they pass more and more tests of intelligence and understanding, will they become conscious? If consciousness is functional, then perhaps a sufficiently advanced AI could be conscious, could have subjective experiences. But if consciousness involves something beyond computation, beyond information processing, then maybe no AI, no matter how intelligent, could be truly conscious. These aren't just theoretical questions. They have ethical implications. If we're uncertain whether an animal or an AI is conscious, how should we treat it? Should we err on the side of caution, assuming consciousness where we're not sure? Or should we require strong evidence before attributing moral status? These decisions depend on how we think about the nature of consciousness, on whether we think the hard problem reveals something genuinely mysterious or is based on misunderstandings. The hard problem also intersects with questions about altered states of consciousness. What is it like to be under anesthesia? Are you completely unconscious? Or is there some minimal form of awareness that you simply don't remember? What about patients in minimally conscious states who show some signs of awareness but can't communicate? Or patients in vegetative states who appear awake but show no signs of awareness? These clinical questions depend on understanding what consciousness is and how to detect it. Recent advances in neuroscience have provided tools for assessing consciousness in non-communicative patients. Techniques like measuring the brain's response to perturbation, its complexity, and integration of activity can give objective measures of the level of consciousness. But these measures depend on theoretical assumptions about what consciousness is, about which neural signatures correspond to conscious experience. And those assumptions are informed by our philosophical understanding of the hard problem. For all the debate, there's one thing most researchers agree on. Consciousness is real. It's not an illusion or a category error. The fact that you're having experiences right now, that there's something it's like to be you, is as certain as anything can be. Descartes' famous cogito, I think, therefore I am, could be updated to I experience, therefore I am conscious. Whatever else we're uncertain about, we can't doubt that we're conscious. The challenge is explaining how consciousness arises from the physical processes of the brain, how subjective experience emerges from objective mechanisms. This is the hard problem, and it remains hard. Perhaps it will be solved by future neuroscience, by better theories of information processing, by new conceptual frameworks we haven't yet imagined. Or perhaps it will remain forever mysterious, a fundamental feature of reality that we can study and characterize, but never fully explain. As we continue exploring consciousness, we need to hold this tension between the remarkable progress neuroscience has made in understanding the mechanisms of the brain and the persistent mystery of why these mechanisms generate subjective experience. Both the progress and the mystery are real. Both deserve our attention. Understanding human consciousness means grappling with both the tractable scientific questions and the deep philosophical puzzles. refusing to dismiss, either as unimportant or unanswerable. If you had to point to a single part of your brain and say, "This is where consciousness happens," you'd face an impossible task. Consciousness isn't localized to one spot, one region, one structure. It emerges from the coordinated activity of multiple brain areas, from patterns of communication between regions, from the integration of information across networks. Understanding consciousness requires understanding not just individual brain areas, but how they work together, how they generate the unified field of awareness we experience. Over the past few decades, several major theories of consciousness have emerged from neuroscience and cognitive science, each offering a different perspective on how the brain generates conscious experience. These theories aren't just abstract philosophizing. They make specific, testable predictions about neural activity, about the brain regions involved, about what kinds of processing are necessary for consciousness. And increasingly, these theories are being put to empirical tests, compared against each other in what's called adversarial collaboration, where proponents of different theories agree on experiments that could distinguish between their views. One of the most influential theories is the global workspace theory, developed by psychologist Bernard Baars and elaborated in neuroscientific terms by Stanislas Dehaene and others. The core idea is simple and elegant. Consciousness arises when information becomes globally available across the brain, accessible to multiple cognitive systems. Think of the brain as a theatre. At any given moment, different processes are happening backstage, unconscious processing in specialized modules. But some information makes it onto the stage, into the spotlight of attention, where it becomes globally broadcast to a wide audience of cognitive systems. This globally broadcast information is what we consciously experience. In neural terms, the global workspace is thought to be implemented by a network of regions spanning frontal and parietal cortex, areas with dense long-range connections to many other brain regions. When these workspace neurons activate strongly and synchronously, they broadcast information throughout the brain, making it available for report, for decision-making, for storage in memory. This global ignition, this widespread activation, is the neural signature of consciousness, according to global workspace theory. The theory explains many features of consciousness. It explains why consciousness seems unified despite being produced by a modular brain. The global broadcast binds information from different modules into a single coherent representation. It explains why consciousness is limited in capacity. Only a limited amount of information can be in the global workspace at once, creating the bottleneck we experience as attention. It explains why we can only consciously attend to one complex task at a time, even though we can do many simple tasks unconsciously in parallel. The global workspace can only handle one broadcast at a time. Global workspace theory also makes testable predictions. It predicts that conscious perception should be associated with a cascade of activation spreading from sensory areas to frontal and parietal regions, creating widespread synchronized activity. And this is exactly what researchers find. When people consciously perceive a stimulus, there's a global pattern of activation, measurable with EEG or fMRI. When the same stimulus is presented, but not consciously perceived, activation remains localized to sensory areas, failing to ignite the global workspace. Another major theory is integrated information theory, or IIT, developed by neuroscientist Giulio Tononi. IIT takes a very different approach, starting not from neural mechanisms, but from the essential properties of consciousness itself. The central claim is that consciousness is integrated information. A system is conscious to the degree that it integrates information, combining multiple pieces of information into a unified whole that's more than the sum of its parts. IIT provides a mathematical framework for quantifying this integration, using a measure called phi. Phi captures how much information a system generates about itself beyond what's generated by its parts in isolation. A system with high phi is highly integrated, with parts that interact in complex ways to create emergent properties. According to IIT, the level of consciousness, how conscious a system is, corresponds to its phi value. The content of consciousness, what a system is conscious of, corresponds to the specific pattern of integrated information. This theory makes some surprising predictions. It predicts that consciousness is graded, coming in degrees, rather than being all or nothing. A system with higher phi is more conscious than one with lower phi. It predicts that consciousness doesn't require any specific substrate. Silicon circuits, if properly organized with high enough phi, could be conscious. But it also predicts that some information processing systems we might think would be conscious, like feed-forward neural networks without recurrent connections, cannot be conscious because they lack integration. IIT has been controversial, partly because some of its implications seem counterintuitive. For instance, it suggests that even simple systems, if they have some level of integration, have some level of consciousness. This form of panpsychism, the view that consciousness is widespread in nature, strikes many as implausible. But Tononi and colleagues argue this is actually a virtue of the theory, that it explains why consciousness seems to be a fundamental feature of the universe, rather than a bizarre exception that only appears in complex brains. Testing IIT is challenging because directly measuring phi in a real brain is computationally intractable. But researchers have developed approximations and have tested various predictions. For instance, IIT predicts that the cerebellum, despite having more neurons than the cerebral cortex, contributes little to consciousness because its architecture is more modular and less integrated. This matches clinical observations. Damage to the cerebellum causes motor and coordination problems, but doesn't seem to affect consciousness per se. In contrast, damage to the cortex can directly impair consciousness. A third major approach is higher order thought theory, developed by philosophers David Rosenthal and others, and elaborated by neuroscientists like Hakwon Lau and Joseph Ledoux. This theory proposes that a mental state is conscious when there's a higher order representation of that state, when the brain not only processes information, but also represents the fact that it's processing that information. In other words, consciousness requires metacognition, thinking about thinking. According to this view, you can have first-order states, like processing visual information about a red apple, that are unconscious if there's no higher-order representation. But when a higher-order representation forms, representing the fact that you're seeing red, that's when the first-order state becomes conscious. Consciousness is thus inherently reflexive, involving the brain monitoring its own states. Higher-order theories suggest that prefrontal regions involved in metacognition and self-monitoring should be crucial for consciousness. This contrasts with theories like IIT that locate consciousness more in posterior cortical areas. Some evidence supports the importance of prefrontal cortex. Damage to these areas can impair certain aspects of consciousness and self-awareness. But other evidence suggests that prefrontal activity may be more related to cognitive access and reporting than to consciousness itself, a distinction we'll return to. Yet, another influential idea is recurrent processing theory, championed by Victor Lamb and others. This theory emphasizes the importance of feedback connections, the pathways that carry information from higher areas of cortex back to lower areas. The brain isn't just a feed-forward system, with information flowing one way from senses to cognition. It's a massively recurrent system, with feedback connections outnumbering feed-forward connections. According to recurrent processing theory, consciousness arises from reverberating activity in recurrent loops, particularly involving sensory cortices and their feedback connections. Local recurrent processing within a sensory area can create phenomenal consciousness, the subjective quality of experience, even without global broadcast. Global recurrent processing, involving frontal and parietal areas, enables access consciousness, the ability to report and use information in decision-making. This theory makes different predictions from global workspace theory. It predicts that conscious perception can occur even without frontal cortex activation, as long as there's recurrent processing in sensory areas. Some evidence supports this. Under certain conditions, stimuli that activate sensory cortex recurrently but don't activate frontal cortex seem to be consciously perceived but not reportable, perhaps indicating phenomenal consciousness without access consciousness. These theories aren't mutually exclusive. They emphasize different aspects of consciousness and may be complementary rather than competing. The global workspace might explain access consciousness, how information becomes available for report and decision-making. Recurrent processing might explain phenomenal consciousness, the subjective quality of experience. Integration might explain the unity and richness of consciousness. Higher-order representations might explain self-awareness and metacognitive aspects. But there are also genuine disagreements, particularly about where in the brain consciousness is generated. Some theories emphasize frontal regions, others posterior regions. Some propose that consciousness requires widespread activation across the cortex. Others, that it can be generated locally in sensory areas. These disagreements lead to different predictions about what happens in particular experimental situations. And testing these predictions is an active area of research. One clever approach is the use of no-report paradigms. Traditionally, studying consciousness requires asking people what they experience, which introduces the problem that the act of reporting might change or add to consciousness itself. The brain activity we measure might reflect not just consciousness, but also the processes of introspection, decision-making, and report. No-report paradigms try to infer consciousness from behavior or brain activity without requiring explicit report, potentially giving a purer measure of consciousness itself. For instance, researchers might use eye movements as an indirect measure of conscious perception. If you consciously perceive an object moving, your eyes will track it even if you don't report seeing it. By measuring these automatic responses, researchers can try to separate conscious perception from the higher-level cognitive processes involved in report. Results from such studies have been used to argue that consciousness can occur without frontal cortex activation, supporting theories that locate consciousness in posterior cortex. Another important development is the use of brain stimulation to test theories causally. By using techniques like transcranial magnetic stimulation or direct electrical stimulation during neurosurgery, researchers can perturb specific brain regions and see how this affects consciousness. Results have been mixed but interesting. Stimulating posterior cortical areas often produces specific conscious experiences, like seeing flashes of light or perceiving faces. Stimulating frontal areas less reliably produces conscious content, though it can affect attention and decision-making. These causal interventions are valuable because correlation isn't causation. Just because a brain region activates when you're conscious doesn't mean that region is necessary for consciousness. It might be a consequence of consciousness rather than a cause. By disrupting a region and seeing whether consciousness is affected, we get stronger evidence about its role. Despite all this empirical progress, fundamental questions remain. Do different theories of consciousness even disagree about facts? Or are they using the word consciousness to mean different things? When one theory talks about phenomenal consciousness and another about access consciousness, are they talking about the same phenomenon? And how do we decide between theories if conscious experience is inherently subjective, accessible only to the person having it? Some philosophers argue that the various theories aren't really competing explanations of the same thing, but are explaining different aspects or kinds of consciousness. What we call consciousness might be a cluster of related phenomena rather than a single unified thing. Arousal is different from attention, which is different from phenomenal experience, which is different from self-awareness, and different theories might be targeting different elements of this cluster. But most consciousness researchers believe there is a real phenomenon, a unified target of explanation, and that we're making genuine progress in understanding it. The disagreements between theories are substantive, and empirical evidence can and will adjudicate between them. We may not yet know which theory is right, but we're developing better tools and better experiments to find out. As these theories mature, and as neuroscience progresses, we're moving toward a science of consciousness, a systematic understanding of how and why conscious experience arises. This doesn't mean the hard problem will be solved, the philosophical puzzle of why physical processes produce subjective experience. But it does mean we're gaining a detailed understanding of the neural basis of consciousness, of the necessary and sufficient conditions for conscious states, of the specific mechanisms involved. And this understanding has practical value. It helps us develop better measures of consciousness in patients who can't communicate. It guides the development of anesthetics that can more precisely control the level of consciousness. It informs the ethics of animal treatment and potentially the treatment of artificial systems. And it deepens our understanding of ourselves, of the most intimate aspect of our existence, our conscious awareness. Picture a room filled with the latest brain scanners, functional MRI machines measuring blood flow, changes that reflect neural activity, EEG caps recording electrical rhythms from the scalp, MEG systems detecting magnetic fields from neural currents. These technologies, which barely existed a few decades ago, have revolutionized consciousness research. For the first time in history, we can watch the brain as it generates conscious experience, tracking the neural activity that corresponds to seeing, hearing, thinking, feeling. We're witnessing consciousness in action, and what we're learning is both illuminating and humbling. One of the most robust findings from brain imaging studies is that consciousness involves widespread, distributed patterns of activity rather than activation in any single area. When you consciously perceive something, when you attend to it and become aware of it, there's a signature pattern: initial activation in sensory cortices, spreading within hundreds of milliseconds to parietal and frontal regions, creating a network of synchronized activity spanning much of the cortex. This pattern has been observed across different sensory modalities, different task demands, different imaging techniques. What's particularly striking is what happens when perception doesn't reach consciousness. When stimuli are masked, presented too briefly to see, or suppressed through binocular rivalry, early sensory cortex still activates, but the later spreading activation doesn't occur. The neural signal stays localized, failing to ignite the broader networks. This dissociation between unconscious and conscious processing gives us a window into the neural basis of awareness. Researchers have identified specific brain rhythms associated with consciousness. Oscillations in the gamma frequency range, around 40 Hz, have been particularly implicated. When neurons across different brain regions oscillate in synchrony at gamma frequencies, this may bind their activities together, creating integrated representations that enter consciousness. Other frequency bands also play roles. Alpha rhythms around 10 Hz are associated with attention and inhibition. Theta rhythms around 6 Hz with memory. Delta rhythms around 2 Hz with sleep and unconsciousness. The interplay of these rhythms creates a complex symphony of neural activity underlying conscious states. Brain connectivity, the pattern of communication between regions, also seems crucial. Consciousness appears to require not just local processing, but effective communication across distant brain areas. Studies of anesthesia have shown that as consciousness fades, brain connectivity becomes more fragmented. Different regions continue to be active, but they stop communicating effectively, becoming isolated islands of processing rather than an integrated network. This breakdown in connectivity may be the neural signature of unconsciousness. Modern neuroscience has also revealed the importance of certain brain structures for maintaining consciousness. The thalamus, we now know, does far more than just relay sensory information. It plays a crucial role in regulating cortical activity, in gating what reaches consciousness. Damage to specific thalamic nuclei can cause profound alterations in consciousness, even while leaving sensory and motor functions relatively intact. The thalamus and cortex appear to work together in tightly coupled thalamocortical loops, with neither alone sufficient for normal consciousness. The brainstem arousal systems also turn out to be more sophisticated than previously thought. Rather than simply turning consciousness on or off like a switch, these systems modulate different aspects of consciousness in complex ways. The locus coeruleus, which releases norepinephrine, affects alertness and attention. The raphe nuclei, releasing serotonin, affect mood and the quality of consciousness. The basal forebrain cholinergic system affects the transition between sleep and waking. Understanding these modulatory systems helps explain why consciousness isn't just present or absent, but varies in quality, in alertness, in clarity. One of the most fascinating recent developments has been the use of brain stimulation, not just to study consciousness, but potentially to restore it. Researchers have found that stimulating certain thalamic regions or cortical areas can increase the level of consciousness in patients in minimally conscious states, sometimes allowing communication that wasn't possible before. While this remains experimental, it opens the possibility of therapeutic interventions for disorders of consciousness. Brain imaging has also shed light on altered states of consciousness. When people meditate, certain brain networks quiet down, particularly the default mode network that's active during mind-wandering and self-referential thought. Experienced meditators show distinctive patterns of brain activity and connectivity, suggesting their conscious experience differs systematically from ordinary waking consciousness. Similarly, psychedelic drugs like psilocybin create characteristic changes in brain connectivity, increasing communication between regions that normally don't interact strongly, potentially explaining the unusual conscious experiences these substances produce. Studies of sleep and dreaming have revealed that consciousness doesn't simply turn off when we fall asleep. Rather, it transforms. During REM sleep, when most dreaming occurs, the brain is highly active, with activity patterns in some ways resembling waking consciousness. But there are crucial differences. Prefrontal regions are less active, potentially explaining the illogical, uncritical quality of dreams. The default mode network shows different patterns of connectivity, perhaps relating to the internally generated, self-focused nature of dream content. Even in deep sleep, when we typically assume unconsciousness, there may be some residual consciousness. Recent studies suggest that some brain areas remain responsive to external stimuli, even in deep sleep, and people can sometimes be trained to respond to external cues while asleep. This challenges the simple dichotomy between consciousness and unconsciousness, suggesting instead a continuum of states with varying degrees and qualities of awareness. The study of patients with disorders of consciousness has been particularly illuminating. Some patients in vegetative states, who appear entirely unresponsive, show brain responses to language and can even follow instructions to imagine specific activities, like playing tennis or navigating through a house. These mental tasks produce distinctive patterns of brain activity that can be detected with fMRI, providing evidence of consciousness and potentially allowing communication through brain imaging. This has profound implications for diagnosis, prognosis, and end-of-life decisions. But brain imaging studies have also revealed how much we still don't understand. We can correlate neural activity with conscious states, but we don't fully understand the mechanisms. Why does this pattern of activity produce consciousness while a different pattern doesn't? What is it about recurrent processing or global integration that creates subjective experience? These questions remain unanswered. There's also the problem of individual differences. People's brains vary in structure and function. Do they also vary in the quality or intensity of consciousness? Some people report vivid mental imagery, seeing pictures in their mind's eye with almost perceptual clarity. Others report little or no mental imagery. Some people have strong emotional responses to events. Others are more stoic. Are these just differences in what we report, or do they reflect genuine differences in conscious experience? Brain imaging can show that different people activate different brain areas during imagery tasks, but it can't tell us whether their subjective experiences differ. Another challenge is the temporality of consciousness. Our conscious experience unfolds in time, with one moment flowing into the next. But most brain imaging techniques have poor temporal resolution. fMRI takes seconds to capture a single image, far too slow to track the rapid dynamics of thought. EEG has better temporal resolution, but poor spatial resolution, making it hard to localize activity. Combining multiple imaging techniques helps, but we're still far from being able to track the full spatio-temporal dynamics of conscious experience. Despite these limitations, the progress has been remarkable. We've gone from treating consciousness as unmeasurable, beyond the reach of science, to having multiple empirical measures, multiple ways of tracking conscious states and contents. We can now take someone in a brain scanner, show them images or sounds, and watch as specific patterns of neural activity correspond to their conscious experiences. We can manipulate consciousness with anesthetics, or sleep, or meditation, and see how the brain changes. We can study patients with altered consciousness and identify the neural differences. This empirical grounding has transformed consciousness from a purely philosophical topic to a scientific one. We're developing theories that make testable predictions. We're conducting experiments that can distinguish between those theories. We're accumulating a body of evidence about the neural basis of consciousness. The field has matured into a genuine science of consciousness, with its own methods, findings, debates, and open questions. And this science is accelerating. New imaging techniques are being developed with better spatial and temporal resolution. Artificial intelligence is being used to decode brain activity, predicting mental states from neural patterns with increasing accuracy. Large-scale brain projects are mapping connectivity and function across the entire brain. Optogenetics and other tools allow precise manipulation of specific cell types in animal models. Within the next few decades, we'll likely have a much more detailed understanding of how the brain generates consciousness. We'll be able to read out mental states from brain activity with high fidelity. We'll understand the detailed mechanisms of integration, the role of different brain rhythms, the precise circuits involved. We may even be able to enhance or restore consciousness in cases where it's diminished or damaged. But will all this progress solve the hard problem? Will understanding the neural mechanisms of consciousness explain why there's something it's like to be conscious? That question remains open. Many neuroscientists believe that yes, as our understanding becomes sufficiently detailed and mechanistic, the mystery will dissolve. Others believe the hard problem will remain even with complete neural understanding. That subjective experience is something that can't be fully captured by third-person science. What seems clear is that the science of consciousness will continue to reveal surprising and important truths about how our brains create our mental lives. Even if some mysteries remain, we're gaining profound insights into one of nature's most remarkable phenomena. And every new discovery, every new technique, every new theory brings us closer to understanding the origins and nature of human consciousness. As we near the end of our journey through the origins of consciousness, it's worth pausing to reflect on how far we've come and how far we still have to go. We've traced consciousness from its possible emergence in ancient oceans over 500 million years ago through the evolution of increasingly complex brains to the extraordinary human consciousness we experience today. We've explored the neural architecture that supports consciousness, the brain regions and networks involved. We've grappled with philosophical puzzles about the nature of subjective experience. And we've seen how modern neuroscience is developing empirical approaches to studying consciousness scientifically. Yet, despite all this progress, fundamental questions remain. We still don't know for certain when consciousness first appeared in evolutionary history. We can't definitively say which animals are conscious and to what degree. We don't fully understand the relationship between neural activity and subjective experience. We haven't solved the hard problem of why physical processes produce phenomenal qualities. These gaps in our understanding aren't failures. They're invitations to further exploration. One of the most pressing questions for the future is about the distribution of consciousness in nature. Which organisms are conscious? We have strong evidence for consciousness in mammals and birds, good evidence for some consciousness in fish, and perhaps some invertebrates like octopuses. But what about insects, with their tiny brains but surprisingly sophisticated behaviors? What about even simpler organisms? Is there some threshold of neural complexity below which consciousness doesn't exist? Or does it shade gradually into non-existence as nervous systems become simpler? Related to this is the question of machine consciousness. As artificial intelligence systems become more sophisticated, as they pass more and more tests of intelligence and understanding, will they become conscious? We can already build systems that recognize images, translate languages, play complex games at superhuman levels. But do any of these systems have subjective experiences? Is there something it's like to be a language model or a chess-playing program? And if not, what would be required for a machine to be conscious? This isn't just a theoretical question. If we create conscious machines, that has profound ethical implications. Conscious beings have moral status, deserve consideration, potentially have rights. But how would we know if a machine is conscious? We can't directly observe its subjective experience any more than we can observe another human's. We'd have to infer consciousness from behavior, from functional organization, from some theory of what consciousness requires. And this brings us back to the need for a better understanding of consciousness itself. Another major question concerns the function of consciousness. Why does consciousness exist? What does it do? We've suggested that consciousness allows for flexible, integrated behavior, for learning and adaptation, for the rich inner life that characterizes human existence. But many cognitive functions can be performed unconsciously. Your brain does enormously complex visual processing before you're consciously aware of what you're seeing. You can learn skills and habits that operate automatically without conscious attention. So, what exactly does consciousness add? Some researchers argue consciousness is essential for certain types of processing, integrating information across modalities, flexible problem solving in novel situations, long-term planning, social cognition. Others suggest consciousness might be more like a user interface, not doing the actual computational work, but providing a simplified, coherent representation of what the brain is doing. Still, others wonder whether consciousness might be epiphenomenal, a byproduct of neural processing that doesn't itself do any causal work, though most find this implausible. Understanding the function of consciousness is important not just theoretically, but practically. If consciousness serves crucial functions, then preserving and restoring consciousness in cases of brain damage becomes a medical priority. If consciousness is necessary for certain types of learning or decision-making, then research on unconscious processing has inherent limits. If consciousness evolved to solve specific problems, understanding those problems might help us understand consciousness itself. The future of consciousness research will likely involve converging evidence from multiple approaches. Neuroscience will continue to identify the neural correlates of consciousness with increasing precision, perhaps eventually pinpointing the exact mechanisms that generate subjective experience. Psychology will refine our understanding of the cognitive functions associated with consciousness and how they develop and vary across individuals. Philosophy will continue to grapple with the conceptual puzzles, helping ensure our scientific theories are addressing the right questions. Computer science and AI may provide new frameworks for thinking about information processing and consciousness. And evolutionary biology will continue to trace the origins and development of consciousness across species and through time. One exciting possibility is that consciousness research will become more integrated with other fields. Understanding consciousness requires understanding attention, memory, perception, emotion, all the various aspects of mental life. As our theories become more sophisticated, they'll need to account for all these phenomena and how they relate to consciousness. This integrative approach may lead to a more unified science of mind, with consciousness as a central organizing concept. Another important direction is the development of practical applications. Better understanding of consciousness can improve the diagnosis and treatment of disorders like coma, vegetative state, minimally conscious state. It can inform the development of better anesthetics and pain management. It can guide the design of brain-computer interfaces and neural prosthetics. It can even influence the design of AI systems, whether we want them to be conscious or specifically want to avoid creating consciousness. There are also profound implications for how we understand ourselves and our place in nature. If consciousness is a fundamental feature of complex information processing, then it may be more widespread than we thought. If it's uniquely tied to specific biological mechanisms, then we're more special, more unusual in the cosmos. If consciousness emerged gradually through evolution, then we're continuous with the rest of life, differing in degree rather than kind. If it emerged in a sudden leap with human language and symbolic thought, then we're genuinely discontinuous, a new kind of being. These questions touch on meaning and value. Is consciousness what makes life valuable? Is subjective experience the locus of moral consideration? If so, then understanding consciousness is understanding the basis of ethics. And if consciousness is what makes us human, what gives us our distinctive place in the world, then understanding its origins is understanding who we are. As you lie here, listening to these words, you're experiencing consciousness firsthand. The sounds of this narration, the feelings in your body, the thoughts arising in your mind, all of this is consciousness in action. You're witnessing the phenomenon we've been exploring, not as an abstract concept, but as lived reality. And in that direct acquaintance with your own consciousness, you have access to something that no brain scan, no theory, no explanation can fully capture, the what it's like of being you. Yet that subjective access also connects you to something larger. When you experience consciousness, you're participating in a process that began hundreds of millions of years ago, that's been refined and elaborated through countless generations, that makes you part of a vast community of conscious beings, past, present, and future. Your consciousness is simultaneously the most private, intimate aspect of your existence and a link to the deepest patterns in nature. The science of consciousness is still young. We've made remarkable progress in the last few decades, but we're likely still in the early stages of understanding. future discoveries may transform how we think about consciousness, revealing aspects we haven't even imagined yet. New technologies may give us unprecedented access to the workings of conscious minds. New theories may solve puzzles that seem intractable today. But even if we one day achieve a complete scientific understanding of consciousness, even if we can predict and control it with perfect precision, there will still be the sheer wonder of it. The fact that the universe contains not just unconscious matter, but conscious experience, beings who can know and care and wonder, remains astonishing. That consciousness emerged through the blind processes of evolution. That billions of years of cosmic and biological history led to this moment, where you're aware of your own awareness, thinking about thinking, is a profound and beautiful fact. So as we close this exploration, take a moment to simply appreciate consciousness itself. Notice the texture of your experience right now, the quality of sound as you hear these words, the feeling of your body resting, the quiet stream of thoughts and images in your mind. This is it. This is consciousness, the most familiar and most mysterious aspect of your existence, the phenomenon that makes you, you. Understanding the origins of human consciousness isn't just an intellectual exercise. It's a form of self-knowledge, a way of understanding our place in the grand sweep of natural history. From ancient organisms sensing their environment to modern humans contemplating the cosmos, consciousness has been a driving force in the story of life on Earth. And that story continues as we use our consciousness to explore consciousness itself, creating new layers of self-awareness, new depths of understanding. The journey to understand consciousness is far from complete, but it's a journey worth taking, because it's a journey to the heart of what we are. Every discovery, every insight, every new perspective enriches our understanding of ourselves and our world. And even the mysteries that remain, the questions we can't yet answer, have value. They remind us that for all our knowledge, for all our science and technology, we still live in a universe full of wonder. Sleep well tonight, knowing that as you drift off, as consciousness fades into dreams, and then into the darkness of deep sleep, you're experiencing one of nature's most remarkable phenomena. And when you wake tomorrow, when consciousness returns, and the world lights up with experience again, you'll be witnessing a small miracle that happens in billions of minds across the planet. A miracle that's been happening for hundreds of millions of years. A miracle we're only beginning to understand. Thank you for joining us on Bedtime Biology tonight. If you found this exploration thought-provoking, if it gave you a new appreciation for the mystery and majesty of consciousness, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. And leave a comment sharing your thoughts about consciousness, about what it means to you, about questions you still have. Until next time, may your consciousness be clear and your dreams be sweet. Good night.